As we continue to look at these four groups of people that John the Baptist is showing us, once we realise this picture of the religious leaders is there to give us a contrast, we can begin to move on to the next group of people that John introduces us to. And they're simply called the crowds. And what we see in Luke 3 in verses 10 and 11 is that the crowds are there when John is preaching his message. The crowds, when we look at our account, I think it's good for us to think that the crowds represent the community. They represent the if you like, the normal people. In our time today, we could look at it and say that the religious people are much like the church, but the crowds are much like the community who are looking on and looking at what's going on. If we think about the crowds, what we can begin to realise is that life for the crowds is not always easy. In fact, in the first century, it was probably pretty hard. You've got this conquered nation where the Romans are ruling and they're bringing civilization, but actually for many people life is pretty hard. For I know Monty Python continually sort of joke, what have the Romans ever done for us? And they've only given us roads and viaducts and sanitation and games and baths and cleanliness and shopping and law and order. The list goes on. But I think the reality is that for many people life is pretty hard, and much of life in those days would probably have revolved around manual labour and manual work. And as you start to think about that, maybe we start to see the crowds are actually a bit like the salt of the earth, as sometimes we talk about today. What we see with these crowds is this huge contrast with the religious leaders, because unlike the religious leaders, the crowds were looking for hope. I guess they had constantly sort of grown up in this religious culture that had this religion of rules, that you're accepted by obeying the rules. If you want to be right with God, then you've got to join the club and do, tick all these boxes and follow all these regulations. Remember, there are rules and regulations enough for every single day of the year. And if you're growing up in that culture and you're growing up constantly being told, you know what, you're not quite good enough, you know what, you don't quite make the mark, then perhaps you grow up with this sense of a loss of hope, and a loss of a sense of purpose, or a loss of a sense of anything to look forward to. And you begin to get a sense, even maybe there's a little bit of a class war going on, that the religious leaders, the religious people are somehow better than the people who are the manual labourers, the crowd. Somehow the religious leaders are of a different class, and consequently you get a little bit perhaps of a class war going on, where the religious leaders are looking down at the crowds and somehow thinking that they're above them, or the crowds are beneath them. And what we've also seen as we've journeyed through John is that for many of the crowds, they're actually exploited by the religious leaders. Just think back to the Sadducees and the way that they run the temple, and we looked back at Annas and Caiaphas and how this family had sort of dominated politics and religion for decades, and had made a profit of what was called the booths of Annas, where they were selling kosher sheep for sacrifice and making people change their money, and the corrupt nature of it. For many of the crowds, their experience to date of religion had been one of being exploited, that actually the crowds were there for the benefit of other people. And I wonder again today, when we look at how the church interacts with its community today, I wonder what perception that the church has of its community. Often I think when people have been Christians for any length of time, they often lose touch with a lot of people who are outside of the church. And consequently there's a gulf that builds between the church and the community. And the challenge for many of us is to find a way to bridge that gap. And we see with John that here is a man who's grown up in the wilderness, who has that prophet's clothing and finds a way to communicate. And I wonder, do you find it easy to communicate with the crowds? Do you find it easy to communicate with the community? How good are you at building the relationships with the community?